Let me start again. Now we should be good. All right. Pull that part up again. Yes. So we're going to talk about Catholic social teaching. A few topics within this. There is so much in the Church's Catholic social teaching that we can't cover it all. So if you're interested in topic areas like this, what's one of the things we do as Catholics is we continue to learn. There's many things that we can continue to learn about, but we'll cover a few areas in this. But in the area of Catholic social teaching, we're applying the Catholic's principles to how do we live together in the various issues that can arise, the different conflicts that we can have within society. And there's 4 principles that form the backbone of Catholic social teaching, and I have them right here: human dignity, common good, solidarity, and subsidiarity. So human dignity we've talked quite a bit about before, right? They're all made in God's image and likeness, and so we have infinite worth, and we need to treat each other only with love. Common good is the idea that all human beings are made in God's image and likeness, and so therefore we should work to the good for every human being that exists. Solidarity is the obligation that we have to take care of our neighbor. So this is illustrated with the biblical stories, parables Jesus teaches, like the Good Samaritan, where it doesn't matter, who is my neighbor that I'm supposed to help? Well, the individual who's there in front of us. Lazarus and the rich man, the story in that parable. Lazarus is the poor man at the doorstep of the rich man, and the rich man is excluded from heaven, not because he outright did something, did bad things. He just ignored his fellow neighbor. He didn't do anything to help Lazarus, right? So we have a responsibility to help those in need. Subsidiarity is the principle where human affairs are best handled at the lowest possible level by those closest to the affected person. So in other words, this is sometimes we can get in the mode of, well, someone else should take care of that, or the government should take care of that. Why do I need to take care of it? But this is the principle that those closest to that are better to take care of the needs of those closest, right? So like, for example, who is best to take care of the needs of children? Parents, primarily. You are the closest, right? Who is the best to take care of the needs of a local area, right? Well, you work with those that live in that area. Local church, local authorities, right? And slowly go up the chain to the lower individuals need help from higher orders, right? So in other words, things like a national government shouldn't try to do the things that a local government is better able to do, right? But sometimes that gets reversed in the order of things. So Catholic social teaching does address a number of issues that arise within the political realm. But some people may wonder, shouldn't the church just stay out of politics? They will sometimes say that in terms of some of the moral teachings that we already described, having to do with sexual ethics, right? Sometimes they'll say, well, the church shouldn't say anything about that because that's a political topic. And the church should just stay out of politics. And there is a reality where, as priests and other leaders of faith, we're not permitted to endorse specific candidates. And so that's why, from the pulpit, you're not going to hear us talk about specific candidates hardly at all. We'll talk about issues, and you're required to be informed from your Catholic point of view, but politics is not, a thing that as priests we're going to directly get involved with. It's only when you hear priests talk about things in the area that overlap with politics, this is usually the way it is that it's usually that government goes into the area of faith and morals. So the area of faith and morals is the church's area of expertise. So when the government starts doing things that go into the area of morals, then the church has every right to speak on those and defend her teachings. All right. Pope Benedict XVI, our previous pope, said that as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, the principal focus of her interventions in the public arena is the protection and promotion of the dignity of the human person. Right? So when things have to deal with the dignity of human life, then we're going to speak and defend the dignity of all human life. And so he spoke too that there's these three non-negotiable principles. These are things that the church is not going to falter on. We protect life in all of its stages, from the first moment of conception until death. We have a recognition and promotion of the natural structure of the family as the union between the man and the woman, based upon God's institution of marriage, and the protection of the right of parents to educate their children. These are things that when things begin to go wrong in the political area, the church speaks out against. So, protection of life involves all sorts of different issues. We've already talked about some of them, like abortion, embryonic stem cell research, euthanasia. We didn't really get to talking about like end of life type issues, I don't have them in this one that we have tonight either, but if we end up having more time, we could talk about those as well. But we're going to defend life from conception until death. So that's why you see a lot of pro-life work that the church does. We defend marriage. So we kind of talked about this. We've talked about the theology of marriage. We talked about defending what marriage is against distortions of it, like same-sex unions. So we talked about quite a bit about that already. The church is going to defend rights of parents to be the first teacher of their children, right? So when society begins to try to teach things that are not good for children, things that are not true, the church is going to defend the right of the parents against impositions, especially from governments. Good piece of advice when we're dealing with, how do we evaluate things with regard to political candidates and political ideas, is that begin with the fundamental important issue, that of right to life, right? So if we have candidates that are in favor of ending the life of innocent life, in particular the unborn, that should begin to put into question, can I trust them in other areas? Because sometimes people are like, well, I like everything they say in these other areas, but if they get the fundamental question wrong, do they understand the most important background behind being able to care for the human beings? Because every issue that we have in the political realm is important because of that fundamental right to life. I mean, we care about poverty because it's human life that's we're dealing with. Things like unemployment and other economic things. We care about human life and being able to live. Things like immigration are important. The environment is important. All these things have to do with human life. So all of these things are important for us because life matters. But the church also says is that you can't just ignore to say, well, I like what someone says about some of these things, and maybe they support abortion, therefore I can support them. Well, if they're wrong on the most fundamental, the most vulnerable of human beings, then are they really supportive of life in these other areas? So, with regard to issues of like legislation and things going on in the church, there's a place we can go to stay informed. Because some people get super into politics. Other people, we have our own lives, and we can't always get involved in understanding everything that's going on there. And how should I think about these issues from a Catholic point of view? And so, a resource that we have is the Nebraska Catholic Conference. This is a group that works closely with our bishops to inform us about what's going on within, especially the legislature. What kind of bills and things are coming up. So they're the ones that kept an eye out for some of those abortion issues that we covered this past fall that we had coming up to help us know what was going on. And so you can actually go to their website, necatholic.org, and they've got resources like bill trackers. So if you want to know what kind of bills are happening right now in the legislature, and you want to know how should we begin to think about these that are going on, it tracks them and it talks about what our Catholic position would be with regard to them. So obviously not every single bill that goes through are we going to have an official Catholic position on, but in certain areas like life and human dignity, marriage and family, education, social human development, we're going to find ones where we can have a Catholic stance. So that's a resource. Obviously, I can talk about some social issues, but there's going to be plenty of things, the specifics of which I can't cover in this. And so this is a resource where you can go and be like, okay, so what's going on? How should I think about this? So there is a resource to go to. But let's talk about a few specific ones. We'll talk about the death penalty. What does the church teach with regard to the death penalty? This one comes up every so often in the political arena. So what is the Catholic principles that we should think to? Well, we can begin with the Ten Commandments. You shall not kill. We have respect for all human life. But the question on here then becomes, but death penalty, we're usually thinking about a criminal of some sort who they themselves may have taken the life of somebody else. So have they forfeited their right to life because they've taken somebody else's right to life? So that would be the question. So what does the church say about this? Well, historically, the church has said that the death penalty, there is a possibility of it being used if it's the only possible way for an authority to defend human life from an unjust aggressor, right? So it has to be an authority, like a government, a state, that's utilizing it. But if it's the only means to prevent an aggressor from harming life, other people's lives. If there are non-lethal means that are sufficient to protect people's safety, then those should be used first. And they should be used in a way that's keeping with the dignity of human life. So I'd be like, so the church is very careful about using it because even someone who is a criminal still has human dignity. They may have, not acted according to their human dignity by the actions that they have done, but the whole Christian faith is the recognition that every person is a criminal, right? From a moral standpoint, we have all sinned and fallen short of the way we should act, right? We are all in need of God's mercy. And that's actually one of the works of mercy that is spoken of in the church. One of them is to ransom the captive. Sometimes it's called to visit the imprisoned, but the more full version is to ransom the captive, to give someone the opportunity to repent of their sins, to be ransomed from their way of sin and begin a new life. That's what Jesus came to do for all of us, to ransom us from sin. And so death penalty applied can remove the opportunity for someone to be ransomed from a sinful way of life. Though some people may argue that, maybe it leads someone to repent more quickly because mortality of our human life can lead us to I better change my way before I die. But historically, the church has given some allowance for its use, but in more recent times, the church will use terms like this, where John Paul II, he spoke about it and said the church says that cases where execution is absolutely necessary are very rare, if not practically non-existent. And Pope Francis has also repeated this as well. And that's why, overall, when these issues have come up, in particular here in Nebraska, we've had that on ballots about the death penalty. The bishops have encouraged us to oppose the use of the death penalty here in our state. That's kind of the overall, without getting into too many of the details about it, that's kind of the overall position that the church has. In theory, it can be used in a limited sense, but in the practical sense, in today's society, it's very rare where that's the only necessity to be used. So, another social issue that we have today, immigration. What does the church teach about this? Right? And what we'll find here is that the church's position on a lot of these issues don't always fit perfectly in the various political kind of divisions, the way people are at it, are either the sides to it. So like today in the area of immigration, oftentimes you'll have these two sides. You'll have those say there should be a strict prevention from all migrants from entering a country, and quick apprehension and deportation of those that are unauthorized, versus the opposite side that says all immigrants, whether they're legal or not, should be welcomed, and then they should even be given all the rights, benefits, privileges, and opportunities that citizens have. And so the question is, well, where does the church fall here? The reality is the church doesn't really fall fully on either side of the political divisions, because the church is not a political body. She is the institution created by God. So what are the Catholic principles that we should follow in understanding what the church teaches? Well, once again, the foundational thing behind everything is life. Right? So we begin with human life. We're dealing with human life. And that's the foundation of all other rights that someone may have. Does someone have a right to immigrate? Well, we have to go all the way back to the right to life. And I want to, let's see, there's a short little clip. This is explained by Deacon Omar Gutierrez. He's a deacon in the Archdiocese of Omaha. He put this together a few years ago. But he kind of explains how the various rights that we have are connected one to the other. So let's see if this plays in the right spot. Okay, good. Hopefully you're able to follow that somewhat. So there are various things that we have right to. We have a right to live because of our dignity that God has created us. In order to live, though, we need certain things so that we can live. First, we need to be able to access food and water. We don't have a right to be given everything to us, but we have a right to access it through various means. For example, one of the ways in which we obtain food and water is through work, being able to labor to obtain what we need to continue to live. In order to work, we need to have things to help us to work, whether it's growing things in the land or other, we use computers or whatever it is. So we have a right to private property, things that we can own to utilize for our work so that we can have food and water, so that we can have life. And so we can either, in the past, everybody, might be more often growing your own food, but if you can't grow your own food, you can trade your work, your labor, in order to get what is needed to continue to live. Right? And so the church talks about someone who works must be paid justly so that they can live. But as you notice, he went on, as we keep going down, things get more complicated because every individual also has rights. And our rights will often come in conflict with other people's rights, and this is the whole purpose of society, is to try to figure out how those balance together. So I mentioned there, yes, a worker has a right to a just wage, but that has to be figured out with their employer, right? A worker can't expect an employer to pay them something that is impossible for them to pay. If you bankrupt their business, then you're not going to have work. So it's not in your best interest to do that. Obviously, if you don't feel like you're getting a just wage, then you have the freedom to go and search for work elsewhere. So there has to be this kind of balancing between rights, responsibilities that each person have. So when we get down to migration, immigrating from one place to another, if we can't find what we need to live where we're at, it doesn't mean we just have to die. We can go elsewhere to try to find the food, the water, the labor to get that food and water if we can't find it where we're at. So we have the right to do that. But there's also responsibility that we'll see. The right to migrate doesn't mean you can just go anywhere, right? You can't be like, well, I'm taking over your house because I want to, No, you don't have a right to do that because that comes in conflict with the right to private property, right? So it becomes more complicated, but in the church's teaching, we can't just someone could say like, well, that no one's allowed to migrate because of private property rights, but that doesn't suddenly mean the person then forfeits their right to life. It has to be worked out as to what is just in this system. So, with regard to migration, and of course the family has to be honored in the midst of all that as to how we're doing it. So, with regard to migration, there's various rights and responsibilities that are involved there. So, the right for someone to migrate will affect the rights of other people. And so, the church teaches in her social teaching that sovereign nations have the right to protect and control their borders for the sake of the common good of their citizens. That's their job, to protect their citizens. The common good includes their security, but also economics as well, that to take into account. So that's one side, right? That's one side of it. Where the nations have a right to protect, and so that would seem to say, they have the right to say not everybody can just come in. But on the other hand, the church also says that nations have an obligation to the universal common good as well, not just to their own citizens, but also to all human beings, which extends beyond the individual borders, right? You can't just say, you are not a citizen, so therefore you have no worth or human dignity, and I don't have to treat you with human dignity. That is also not right to do. So there are rights and responsibilities that nations where immigrants may be trying to come in, that they have. It's also the case in the opposite end too. Those that are immigrants also not only have rights but also responsibilities in the way that they also must act. So here's another thing from the Catechism. The more prosperous nations are obliged to the extent they are able, right? So it's not an unlimited obligation, to welcome the foreigner in search of the security and the means of livelihood which he cannot find in his own country of origin, right? So if you have resources in that country and you have availability, there is an obligation to extend help to those that are in need, right? At the same time, it also says immigrants are obliged to respect with gratitude the material and spiritual heritage of the country that receives them, to obey its laws, and to assist in carrying out civic burdens, right? So an immigrant that comes in also has a duty to respect the processes, the laws that are in place of the country that they are wishing to enter. They can't just do whatever they want. They have to respect where they're going. See here that the church gives these general principles, but then how does that specifically work out with regard to policies? The church herself doesn't have in her teaching, this is the exact policy that must be laid out, right? And so Catholics of goodwill can have lively discussions with one another as to how should these principles be worked out, but we can't deny the principles themselves, right? So if someone tries denying and saying, well, the church the countries have no responsibility to, they have no ability to protect borders, well, that's not correct. The church says that they do. But if it says, well, they have no responsibility to any immigrants whatsoever, that is also not correct, right? So trying to balance that and figure out what is a just policy is not always an easy thing, but the church is not going to give this specific and say, this country must do it this way, right? She will point out when countries in their policies are not honoring parts of her teaching. She will point that out, but she doesn't give this is the only way that this is implemented kind of situation. So we might like it to be more just cut and dry and be like, oh, this is exactly the way a Catholic has to think about each of these, but there's a balancing act between the various rights and responsibilities when we're dealing with the messiness of human life. Another issue that often comes up is the issue of gun control. So we'll talk about that. Obviously, there are those that want to defend the ability to have the freedom to use firearms in our country in particular. And then there's those that see them used for atrocities, especially those against children. And so there's the question as to, what should policies with regard to the use of guns be? And so what would the Catholic principles, to help us sort through this, where would we go? Well, once again, we would start with life. You shall not kill. Obviously, to use a tool, gun or otherwise, to commit murder is going to be morally evil, right? But things become a little bit more complicated when you look further into the Church's teaching. You look in the Catechism again, and the Church does teach about legitimate self-defense. So there is legitimate self-defense of persons and societies, which isn't an exception, it says, to the prohibition against murder, but instead an act of self-defense, it says, can have a double effect: the preservation of one's own life and the killing of the aggressor. One that's intended and one that's not, right? So self-defense is, my intention is to protect myself, and we'll see also it may be protecting those that one has responsibility for, versus the secondary effect: in order to protect myself, it required the ending of the life of the one that was aggressing against me, right? So the Church teaches that love of oneself is a fundamental principle of morality, right? That's what love your neighbor as yourself, right? We should love ourselves. We should have a proper love of ourselves, not an inordinate love of ourselves, which becomes sinful selfishness and pride. But we have a love for our own life. So it's legitimate, the Church says, to insist upon respect of one's own right to life, right? So we can insist upon, or we have to strive to protect our own life. Someone who defends his life is not guilty of murder, even if he's forced to deal with an aggressor a lethal blow, right? So self-defense, even if it brings even if it's in a lethal means, is not on the same par morally as murder is. As murder is morally reprehensible. The Catechism continues, if a man in self-defense uses more than necessary violence, it will be unlawful, right? So you can't, if someone is, you have someone who's attacking you through insults, you can't just, stab them. That is unnecessary violence in that case, right? Whereas if he repels force with moderation, his defense will be lawful, right? So we shouldn't automatically go to, the highest form of defense that we possibly can that would automatically take someone's life. But it also says, nor is it necessary for salvation that a man omit the act of moderate self-defense to avoid killing the other man. So in other words, if the only way to protect one's life could cause the death of the one who's aggressing against you, you're not morally responsible to let them kill you. You can morally defend yourself. Since one is bound to care more for one's own life than another's, right? So we morally are obliged to care for our life first, and then we care for, because if we don't have our own life, we can't care for someone else's life. I suppose you might think of it in terms of when you're on airplanes, they're like, the parents are supposed to put the oxygen mask on first, and then you help the children, right? Just make sure that you don't pass out before. Legitimate defense can not only be a right, but a grave duty for someone responsible for another's life. So not only do we have the right to protect and even use force to protect human life, in cases where you have the responsibility over someone else, you have the duty to do so from a moral standpoint, right? So like, for example, parents protecting their children. You have a duty to protect the lives of your children. Yes, so preserving the common good requires rendering the unjust aggressor unable to inflict harm, and to this end, those holding legitimate authority have the right to repel by armed aggression against the civil community entrusted to their charge. So that's why you can have things like police forces, and you can have militaries, where those in legitimate authority may have to use force to protect the common good of the people against those that would attack the common good, right? So, Christians can be soldiers, can be policemen, even though they may have to use force and end the life of an aggressor. They're not committing sin when they do that, as long as they're doing it in a proper manner. There's limitations with this self-defense, though, especially in the area of this kind of bigger picture with regard to war. The church has principles of just war that must be met in order for a war to be just. One of the important things is that, war must, in order for a war to be, a country to go into war in a just manner, it's always going to be defensive. Aggressive war, where one attacks purposefully another, that is never a moral war, because you now are becoming the aggressor to end life to get some kind of gain, and that's not a moral action. But upon entering into a war, in order for it to be just, all these principles must be met, all of them. The damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation must be lasting, grave, and certain, right? So it must be a severe thing that's happening. The attack is a severe thing. All other means of putting it to an end have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. So in other words, you've got to try to end it in other means, but diplomacy maybe in failing. There must be a serious prospect of success, right? So to go in there must be prospect of being able to repel the attacking force, being able to be successful. And the use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition, right? Because now we have weapons, bombs that can, wipe out large swaths of people, and so, the response to an aggression needs to be on par. If you had a group of people are attacking with bows and arrows, to come back and drop bombs on them, that's not a commensurate reaction to that. One could repel that aggression with something not as extreme, right? And so that's what's required for just war. Prudential judgment has to be used for those with responsibility to figure out, whether we're entering this justly. Then during times of war doesn't mean you can just do anything you want. There's also moral limits to the kinds of things you could do. That's why, sometimes you'll probably hear people talk about, war crimes. Right? There are crimes that can be committed during times of war that aren't just. So, for example, these are things that, the immunity of non-combatants. So civilians should not be what we directly attack. If we're purposely directly attacking civilians, that is an immoral thing to do in war. Under that would also fall things like using civilians as a shield, to protect oneself behind. That's also an immoral action. Proportionality, using the minimum force necessary to obtain the objectives. So I kind of alluded to that already. And the right intention, right? The desire must be to obtain peace and justice. Your desire shouldn't be, hey, we can enter this war and gain land and gain resources, right? Of course, the thing is, when it comes to war and governments, human hearts are not always they don't always the right intentions with regard to things, right? So with regard to war, things like, obviously genocide and destruction indiscriminately of vast areas, those kinds of things are going to be morally reprehensible and not allowed morally. So how does this all apply to the smaller level of owning guns? Well, the church in her teachings itself, there's not really major documents in the church that deal specifically with this issue. This is very much a United States thing, and the church is worldwide, and so she addressed all sorts of things but hasn't specifically addressed this. We do have this document, which is from a pontifical commission, which is not on the same level as like papal teaching. But this is one of the few places where it does say something. It's urgent to find an effective way to stop the flow of arms to terrorist and criminal groups. Obviously, the use of weapons for those who are going to use it to harm others. So an indispensable measure would be for each state to impose a strict control on the sale of arms, limiting purchase would not infringe upon the right. So basically it's saying, some kind of limitations should make sense with regard to, and so like we find that, for example, in our country, there's all sorts of different laws and, background checks and things like that. But other than that, some people, Pope Francis has in the past tweeted things like, do we really want peace? Then let's ban all weapons so we don't have to live in fear of war. Of course, Pope Francis tweeting isn't like church doctrine. So he's not trying to introduce something specifically with church teaching there. And the difficulty is that we would want peace, but we also live in a fallen human world as well. What have our U.S. bishops said? Different individual bishops have different thoughts. I mean, there's bishops that are avid hunters, gun owners. Other bishops favor greater restrictions. But there can be a legitimate diversity within Catholic thought in this area, since the church doesn't have that. One of the things that sometimes is missed in this issue is that the way that we think about this is not just in terms of an object that's used in a good or bad way. It's in terms of why does someone use something in a good or bad way, right? This is where the moral issue really hits in a greater way is not just the object that could be like a gun, but it's the person themselves, right? Are there other factors that lead someone to commit a crime, right? And we know that that's the case if you look at criminology, that there's other factors like family issues, mental illness, peer pressure, social economical issues that could lead someone on that path. And so the church also has to recognize that evil doesn't have its origin in an inanimate object. Evil has its origin within the human heart, right? And ultimately, banning an object will not remove the fallen nature of humanity, right? We are good human beings. God has created us in His image. We're made for love, but we are fallen. We choose to turn away from Him. So, would eliminating guns completely prevent people from choosing to do evil? It wouldn't. Could it prevent them from doing certain kinds of evil? Yes. And that would be, in society, has to figure out, what is the best way to balance those two things. Because guns can also be used for a good thing, right? Protection, right? We already saw self-defense. There's a legitimate place for that. But remember, we're also when we're dealing with sin, people are not always going to they're not always going to act in a rational means, which is why it makes it much harder sometimes to deal with those issues, because people don't act in a reasonable fashion. By its definition, sin is not reasonable. All right. Another issue that often comes up, I'm calling it care for our common home, but these would be issues having to do with environment type issues, right? So you hear all sorts of different sides as to where an environment might be going. Are we is there going to be climate catastrophe, coming up? What does the church specifically teach with regard to this? Pope Francis has very much taught. He's published several documents now on caring for our common home. The first one was, when was that? In 2000 and I want to say maybe 15. Laudato Si is the name of the first one that he published, and he published one more recently. all sorts of opinions as to what's the best ways in which to care for a common home, using, renewable resources. So what does the church teach specifically with regard to this? The church is going to teach that we want to care for the world that God has given to us, but that not necessarily everything everyone says with regarding to, like, this is how we should do it, is the church going to accept. In fact, Pope Francis has critiqued certain green ideas that are sometimes proposed. So, for example, in this one, he says, at times this attitude exists side by side with a green rhetoric. Today, let's see. So many professionals, opinion makers, communication media, and centers of power being located in affluent urban areas are far removed from the poor with little direct contact with their problems. It can lead to a numbing of conscience and tendentious analyses which neglect parts of reality. At times this attitude exists side by side with a green rhetoric. So what he's going to be very concerned about is, with regard to caring for a common home, he cares about the human person, in particular the poor. And so he points out that when we do certain things and decide, this action is going to help with the environment, he wants us to, how is this going to affect the poorest people, right? Obviously, there's certain things we can do that hurts the environment that's going to affect poor people the most because they don't have the monetary abilities to adapt to some of those changes. But at the other end of it, you can impose certain restrictions on using certain things. That's going to also inadvertently affect the poor in a negative fashion. So that's what he's going to point out. That's going to be a principle that's important. And a difference between Catholic environmental stewardship and secular environmentalism is that secular environmentalism often is all about the environment and has a very negative view about humans, that human beings are a negative impact upon the environment and, in a sense, in some cases, should be eliminated so as to care for the environment, whereas the Catholic version is we care for the environment because of human beings, right? And this idea of environmental stewardship and taking care of the environment goes much further back than the recent popes. We can go all the way back to the beginnings of the origins of it in with Catholic social teaching in the late 1800s. The church teaches about a balance between private property and the blessing of nature, which is given to the whole human race. So the church affirms that there's a proper use of the riches of the earth, right? Just as God gave to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, right? Till and guard and care for the land, right? In the 1930s, Pope continues to emphasize the right that we have to private ownership. Let's see. Yes, that may be able to provide for themselves and their families, but also that the goods which the Creator destined for the entire family. So this balance between what we own individually, but also the things that are helping everyone to live and be cared for. John Paul II, 1961. Genesis relates how God gave 2 commandments to our first parents to transmit human life. So that's what I was just referencing, to increase and multiply and bring nature into their service, fill the earth and subdue it. These commandments are complementary. So this is a very important principle against modern forms of secular environmentalism, which sees these things in opposition to each other. Caring for the environment and the population of human beings, there's an aspect today where in order to care for the environment, we should get rid of the population of human beings. But he says these are complementary, but he also says nothing in the second of these commandments is about destroying nature. Right? So we also have even though we're given this right to utilize the world around us, we don't have the right to just simply destroy things. We have to care for what God has given to us. Then in the Second Vatican Council, God destined the earth and all it contains for the use of every individual and all peoples. Right? So there's going to be this close connection between us and the planet God has given to us. Paul VI teaches that the Bible teaches the whole of creation is for humanity. It's our responsibility to develop it and to use our labor to perfect it, so to speak, for our use. The world is made to furnish the individual with the means of livelihood and the instruments to grow and progress. All people who have therefore the right to find in the world what's necessary for them, right? So all of us can use God's creation for our livelihood, to uphold our right to life. But also said we're becoming more aware that an ill-considered exploitation of nature, we risk destroying it. All right, and then by that we would become our own victim. If we destroy our own place where we live, we become victims of that misuse. John Paul II, he proclaimed St. Francis of Assisi as the patron saint of ecologists. He also spoke more about a new ecological awareness, to pay attention to how we're caring for our environment. Let's see here. What was the thing that I wanted to bring out in this one? Yes, so note in here that commitment of believers to a healthy environment for everyone stems directly from our belief that God created it, right? So it's part of our faith that we would care for the world that God made. It's not ours just to do whatever we want. God has created us, and we are stewards. We're good stewards of the world that He's given to us. And part of that includes respect for life and the dignity of the human person, because we are part of God's creation. So we also must respect human life. Benedict XVI, of all the popes, Benedict XVI was the first one who was called the Green Pope, because he spoke quite a bit, even before Pope Francis, he spoke a bit about caring for the environment. We need to care for the environment. It's been entrusted to us to be protected and cultivated with responsible freedom. Right? We need to care for it. Pope Francis, there's the document he wrote, Laudato Si. It's quite a lengthy document, so there's a lot of stuff in there. So I'm not going to read it all here tonight. He was attempting in that to provide an approach to ecology which respects our unique place as human beings in this world and our relationship with our surroundings. So you see, in all of these teachings of the church, there's this connection between the environment around us and us as human beings, right? So to summarize, the main difference I mentioned earlier between Catholic teachings on environmental stewardship and the secular environmentalism is the way that the human person is treated. The human person ought to be treated with respect and dignity, and since we're part of nature, we can't just if we're going to care for nature, that means also caring for a human being. And this is, you might say, well, that makes sense, but it's important because of the way secular environmental has gone, which is sometimes why Christians or Catholics might have the temptation to reject caring for things having to do with the environment because of the distortion that secular versions can do. Often these things are about trying to control human populations because they see them in opposition to the environment. So these are some ideas that have been, different environmentalists have written about. Human beings as a species have no more value than slugs. Right? That is certainly not a Christian understanding of human beings. We advocate biodiversity for biodiversity's sake. It may take our extinction to set things straight. That's not a very Christian understanding, the extinction of human beings. I know scientists who remind me that people are a part of nature, but it isn't true. Somewhere along the line, we quit the contract and became a cancer, right? So this thought is that we are a cancer upon the earth. These are not the way in which we would see that. But those with attitudes like that have proposed things of trying to control population. This goes all the way back into the late 1700s. At that time, the concept was called Malthusianism, named after Malthus, who thought that human population would just continue with exponential growth and resources would continue along a linear line and people would begin to die because there's just not enough resources. Of course, the things he couldn't understand is that straight line of resources is not a straight line. Technological advances have increased our ability to have resources for our human beings. And the same way with that exponential growth of human population, that also has not, it looks a bit different from that. There were, especially in the 1960s, 70s, There was warns that there was going to be mass starvation because of too many human beings, and so there were suggested things to do that to try to get our growth rate to 0 or even be negative. You've got things like the push of contraceptives is part of that kind of mentality that human beings are this kind of, less of us is better to have. Here's the world population. There has been a kind of exponential growth in world population compared to in the past. But when we look more closely in, we find that the rate of growth is declining. So there actually is we're getting to the point where population is going to peak and begin to decline if we continue along the course that we're at. Let's see. Yeah, so here you go. Here's the rate of growth. Projection into the future. It's going to hit a peak, and then if we don't have a replacement rate that is positive, 2.1 peak is the replacement rate. If we don't have that kind of a rate, then the world population will begin to decline, and that has all sorts of implications to if that occurs. So Pope Francis so some people will use all this and say, well, how could you possibly have children? How could you have a family? And during a time when the responsible thing would be to do is to have no children so you can save the environment. But that is not the way that the church looks at it. In fact, here's Pope Francis. He says, the fact of having brothers and sisters is good for you. The sons and daughters of a large family are more capable of fraternal communion, even from early childhood. In a world often marked by selfishness, a large family is a school of solidarity and sharing. This attitude is to the benefit of society as a whole. He continues in other places. He says, we should not be afraid to take the risk of welcoming children. Today there's a certain selfishness. The other day I spoke about the demographic winter there is nowadays. So that's what he's talking about, where there's this decline of the birth rate in many countries, including our own, in which we see that people do not want to have children or just one and no more. And many, many couples do not have children because they do not want to, or they have just one. But they have 2 dogs, 2 cats. Yes, dogs and cats take the place of children. And this denial of fatherhood and motherhood diminishes us. It takes away our humanity. And in this way, civilization becomes aged and without humanity because it loses the richness of fatherhood and motherhood. Our homeland suffers. It does not have children. And as has been said somewhat humorously, and now who will pay the taxes for my pension if there are no children? With laughter, but it is the truth. Who will take care of me? Right? It's not good if we invert the pyramid. Because for most people, you should have, you've got more. If you start having fewer children than the previous generation, then the population is going to decline, and you're no longer be able to support society the way that it is. And we're feeling that, especially in our rural areas, where we don't have as many people. We've been declining in our population since the 1920s, and the retirement of the big baby boom generation is really starting to impact the way that we see that, even like jobs and wise. All right. Yes, he continues and says, I asked St. Joseph the grace to awaken consciences and think about this, about having children. Fatherhood and motherhood are the fullness of life of a person. Think about this. It is true. There is a spiritual fatherhood of those who consecrated themselves to God, like the priest, spiritual motherhood, like religious sisters. But those who live in the world and get married, think about having children, of giving life, which they will take from you for the future. And also, if you can't have children, think about adoption. It is a risk, yes. Having a child is always a risk, either naturally or by adoption, but it is riskier not to have them. It is riskier to deny fatherhood or to deny motherhood. But denial, a man or woman who does not develop the sense of fatherhood or motherhood, they're lacking something. So you can see he very much cares about this. Let's see. So here he addresses specifically some of the fears with regard to like environmental and poverty and things like that. He says the main cause, some people he says, I've heard it said that some families with many children and the birth of many children are among the causes of poverty. But he says, this opinion seems simplistic to me. I can say that the main cause of poverty is an economic system that has canceled the person from the center and set money in its place, right? So large families are not what causes poverty, he says. It's a system that makes life all about money. That is what's going to cause poverty. We don't really have we're out of time for tonight. We don't really have time to get into it, and I don't really want to go into it too much. But if you look into Catholic social teaching, the Catholic social teaching does have teachings with regard to economic systems. Which systems are more moral than others? And since the Church's social doctrine affirms things like private property and free markets, the Church sees that democratic and free market societies can be more moral than things like communism, socialism. Those are explicitly rejected by the Church as being incompatible with human dignity. So sometimes people they advocate for those kinds of, communist, socialist regimes. Those are incompatible with Christian faith. Now, democracy and free market can also go bad in certain ways. The Church will also speak against consumerism, as well as what Pope Francis calls oftentimes the throwaway culture, right? Where, we throw away not only things, but we also throw away people. But that is probably all we need to get into. That's stuff for another time. But yes, there is a spirituality that goes with ecology, and that's the spirituality of conversion away from selfishness. Consumerist throwaway mentality is all about wanting more and more and money and things. But rather it should be, we can use things, right? We have legitimate use of private property. We can own things. Nothing wrong with that. But the things shouldn't own us, right? If our things begin to own us and we are consumed ever by having to get more and more in the next new thing, then we don't really own them anymore. They are controlling our lives. Instead, it should be a reality of simplicity of heart, right? Where we can be satisfied with the gifts that God does give us. We can certainly always strive for more, but a certain detachment from always having to have more and more. So there's a balance there with that. So anyway, that's enough for tonight. And let's see. Want to make a note, because we are entering into Holy Week next week. We have practice on Saturday. So you'll be joining the church on the Easter Vigil at 8:30. Both of the vigils are at 8:30 in Osmond and Hardington. Practices, I mentioned last time the Osmond practice is, I think I said 1:30. Is that what I said? I said 1 p.m. 1 p.m. See, you remember better than I. I've got so many dates, times I can't remember. Yeah, 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock in Osmond, and Father Cordy wants to have his practice in Hardington at 10 o'clock on Saturday. So if your sponsor can be there for the practice, that'd be great. Otherwise, they should certainly be there for the vigil itself. So it'll be better if they're there for practice, because then you can kind of walk through it and feel how it's supposed to go.
We don't have class next week.
And we will omit class. And I guess we talked about last time that we may not have class again. Because the next time I could potentially do class is I guess I could do class on the 6th. If I don't go to the Solemn Vespers in Omaha. So, anyway, I'll keep that in my mind as we go through as to whether we'll have another class in person otherwise. All right, any questions? I will have, I better mention that. I put together together your little cheat sheets for the things that you say. So I'll give those to you guys at your rehearsal, so you'll know the things that you need to say. And I'll send you the document with it in, so that you can, if you want to practice your lines now. So very, very simple. For candidates, we call you up by name. Well, I'll do it in order. So for catechumens, those need to be baptized come forward first. So when we call your name, you say, "I have been called, thanks be to God." And then you come forward. And then you renew your baptismal, you make your baptismal promises. So you say, "I do," after each of those. And then those that are going to be joining the church, you come forward again when I call you. "I have been called, thanks be to God." Same line. And then you make your profession of faith. You say, "I believe and profess all that the Holy Catholic Church believes, teaches, and proclaims as revealed by God." So you'll say that all together. And then you'll all then be confirmed. And the lines you have for confirmation is, I say, with your confirmation name, and I've got all your little confirmation names here to remind me your names. So let's see. And so then I'll say, "Monica, be sealed with the gift of the Holy Spirit." And you say, "Amen. Peace be with you and with your spirit." So, but everything's on your little sheet there. So, all right. Yes, and I encourage you, so the Easter Vigil, to certainly be there, but I would encourage you to participate as much as you're able with the other days of the Easter Triduum. So you won't have a specific role in Holy Thursday Mass, but to get the full experience of the Sacred Triduum, it's really good to come to Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and then the Easter Vigil. So, and I should note that if you go to the Easter Vigil, that is an Easter Mass. So going to the Easter Vigil counts for Easter, so you don't have to go to Easter Mass the next morning, unless you want to. So it is the Easter Mass. By the time we get done, I have to get up early for the next one, but you guys won't have to. So, all right, any other questions? All right, very good.